Chapter 1: The Arrival at Blackwater Village. The fog was thick, crawling across the narrow road like a sluggish serpent. Richard hadn't seen another car for miles, and the worn tires of his old Subaru crunched over pebbles and brittle twigs. His headlights illuminated barely 10 feet ahead, the mist so dense that it swallowed the beam whole. The village of Blackwater lay at the edge of civilization, an isolated speck on no tourist map, with a population that could be counted on two hands. Richard had only come here for peace. After his fiancée's sudden death 6 months ago, the memories in the city had become unbearable. Blackwater promised silence, a chance to breathe, maybe even sleep. When he reached the small cottage he had rented, Richard's stomach churned with unease. It wasn't the crooked shutters or the peeling paint that unsettled him, it was the unsettling stillness. Not a single bird chirped in the trees, nor did any leaves rustle. It was as though the world held its breath. The landlord, a man in his 60s with an unnerving, toothless smile, had handed over the key with a warning: "Don't wander out after midnight. Things get strange in the fog." Richard had laughed it off at the time. He wasn't a superstitious man, just a broken one. But now, standing alone at the door of the cottage with the fog pressing up against the windows, the old man's words lingered in his mind like a bad smell. He unlocked the door and stepped inside, dropping his bags by the entrance. The air was stale and cold. Shadows stretched across the floor, pulling in the corners where the weak light from the hallway lamp couldn't reach. As he moved through the cottage, a peculiar sensation crawled over him, the feeling that the house was watching him. That night, Richard lay on the creaky bed, blankets drawn to his chin. He could hear nothing beyond the walls, no wind, no insects, just an oppressive silence. Until the whispers began. They were soft at first, like the faint hum of distant voices carried by the fog. Richard sat bolt upright, straining his ears. He could make out fragments, words murmured just beneath the threshold of understanding. "You shouldn't have come. It's not safe. We've been waiting for you." He leapt out of bed and pressed his ear to the window. But there was nothing outside, only the swirling fog, so thick it seemed to cling to the walls. And then, just as suddenly as they had begun, the whispers stopped. Chapter 2: The Strangers. The following morning, Richard ventured into the heart of Blackwater. The village was eerily quiet. A cluster of run-down buildings gathered along a single muddy road, their windows clouded and their doorways dark. He stopped at a small general store to buy some groceries. The store owner, a gaunt woman with pale skin and watery blue eyes, greeted him with an odd smile, one that seemed too wide for her face. "New to town?" she asked, her voice unnervingly sweet. "Yes," Richard muttered, placing a loaf of bread and some canned goods on the counter. She stared at him, her expression shifting to something more calculating. "You're renting old McAllister's place, aren't you?" Richard nodded slowly, uneasy under her gaze. "You'll want to leave before the next fog rolls in," she whispered, leaning closer. "Some doors, once opened, can't be shut again." Before Richard could respond, she handed him his change, her cold fingers brushing against his hand for just a moment too long. On his way out, he noticed a group of villagers standing across the street. They watched him with unsettling intensity, their faces unreadable. As Richard turned to leave, he could have sworn he saw one of them mouth a single word. "Run." Chapter 3: The Voices Return. That night, the fog rolled in thick and fast. It coiled around the house, slithering through the cracks in the window frames and beneath the door. Richard lit every lamp in the cottage, but it did little to push back the darkness that seemed to press in on him from all sides. And then the whispers came back, louder this time. "Richard! Come outside. We're waiting." His blood turned to ice. They knew his name. Panic gripped him, and he paced the room, clutching his phone. No signal. The landline was dead, too. He could feel the pressure of the fog outside, as if it were alive, an invisible force watching, waiting. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. They slithered into his ears, wrapping around his thoughts like tendrils. He tried to drown them out by covering his ears, but it was useless. The voices were inside his head. Suddenly, there was a loud knock on the front door. Richard froze. The knock came again, slow and deliberate. "Who's there?" he called, his voice trembling. No answer. He approached the door with shaking hands. When he opened it, there was no one there. Only the swirling fog, thick and impenetrable. And then he saw them, shapes moving within the mist. Pale, gaunt figures with hollow eyes, their mouths stretched into silent screams. They were watching him. Richard slammed the door shut and stumbled back, heart pounding. The whispers were louder now, filling the room like a cacophony of desperate pleas. "Let us in. We need you. There's no escape." Chapter 4, The Descent. For 3 nights, the whispers tormented him. Richard didn't sleep. He barely ate, his mind unraveled bit by bit, frayed at the edges by the endless murmurings and the unrelenting fog. He tried to leave the village, but every road seemed to loop back on itself. No matter how far he drove, the fog thickened until he was forced to turn back. It was as if Blackwater was a trap, a place that wouldn't let him go. The villagers offered no help. When he asked the old landlord about the voices, the man simply grinned and said, "They only come for the ones who belong." Richard didn't understand what that meant, until he found the journal hidden beneath the floorboards of the cottage. It belonged to the previous tenant, a man named Samuel McAllister. The entries became increasingly erratic, detailing strange encounters with fog-bound figures and nights filled with endless whispers. The final entry was scrawled in a shaking hand. "They don't want me anymore. They want him. He's the one they've been waiting for." The date of the entry chilled Richard to his core. It was written the night before he arrived. Chapter 5, The Embrace of the Fog. On the 5th night, Richard could feel the end approaching. The fog pressed harder against the windows, seeping through the walls like smoke. The whispers were everywhere now, filling the room, his mind, his soul. He sat in the middle of the living room, clutching the journal to his chest. There was no escape. He knew that now. The knock came again, slow, deliberate. This time, Richard didn't hesitate. He rose to his feet and opened the door. The figures in the fog were waiting for him, their hollow eyes gleaming with a terrible hunger. Richard stepped forward, his body trembling but his mind strangely calm. As the fog enveloped him, the whispers became a song, a lullaby that soothed the ache in his chest. And then, just as quickly as it had come, the fog began to thin. When the villagers found the cottage the next morning, it was empty. The only sign that Richard had ever been there was the journal, lying open on the floor. The final entry was written in a shaky hand. "I belong to the fog now. And soon, so will you." The villagers never spoke of Richard again. But on certain nights, when the fog rolls in thick over Blackwater, they swear they can hear him, his voice joining the whispers, calling out to the next soul who dares to stay. Waiting. Always waiting.